Hello, class 398N. This is a short video to draw your attention to something you will need for project 3, and that's exposure. So let's talk exposure. Now, what you have in front of me, it's a PDF, which is already available on ELMS. And I will briefly, I will not read everything, that's for you to do if you want to learn more. But I will briefly go through the exposure triangle. And we see that we have shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Of those three, only the shutter speed and aperture actually affect the luminous brightness of your image. Here on this slide, notice the discussion about stops of light. Each of them, the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO also have their stops of light. And this page, I believe, brings the three together and shows where there is more light or less light, depending on what setting you create. So project 3 involves shooting motion. And shooting motion is basically capturing image blur. And there are techniques how to do it. That's when you set your shutter speed. There is also here what I talk about artistic blur. Don't worry about it right now. We just want to manage how to do motion using the shutter speed. Here is a detailed description how to do that and examples. And then we have aperture. And aperture is the other very important setting on your camera, and it's good to get to know about it. The way it's described is that, aperture is in your camera is basically something akin to a pupil that opens up and closes depending on how much light you set the aperture to allow in. And so aperture is good for regulating the light. Okay, so the exposure, the brightness of your camera, but it's also used when you want to shoot different depths of field. And that is described on the following slide. And you see the inverted relationship between depth of field and aperture size. A large depth of field with small aperture, a pointed, very focused depth of field with a large aperture. Next, I'm sorry, I apologize for this page here. The table I downloaded from the internet, and obviously it's not very sharp, but I hope you can see the text and you can relate the aperture and the depth of field. And then 9, it's finally ISO. ISO, I said, is not really part of the luminous exposure. Well, it does regulate the sensitivity to light, the senses sensitivity to light. And it's good to have, but it's not always good news. So here I give you some examples of what ISO can do. And what you need to note also that it brightens the photo in camera, which means after the sensor has already been exposed to the light. That's why it's very important to know what it does, but also you should be aware that maybe you shouldn't play with it right now. Okay. And that concludes my presentation on exposure. I will have the video posted up online, and we can talk about exposure more on Wednesday. See you then.